So finally, I think I'm ready to review the Tarptent Rainshadow 3. Those of you guys who follow the channel know that I purchased this in early summer sometime. That setup video is in the cards and also in the description down below. So if you want to see how I set it up for the first time, there's nothing new about the setup that I've discovered. It's pretty simple once you get the hang of it. And if you want to look at a detailed look at how to set it up, that's where I would go. This is of course the review video where I talk about how things performed, the pros and cons of the Tarptent Rainshadow 3, as well as just my overall impressions of it after having used it multiple nights at this point. It's gone on one major backpacking trip where I didn't expect to use it in Utah, and I've done a lot of camping around the area with my kids multiple nights as well. But let's start off with overall specs. When you think about it, if you are using 3 people for this 3-person tent, you're getting a smidge over a pound per person of carried weight. If you think about space to weight ratio, it's a pretty good bang for your buck. A pound and some change is actually a little lighter than a lot of hammock setups out there, and lighter than a lot of tents out there. You have to get a really ultralight tent in order to get that size to weight ratio. It has a lot of great headroom. I'm 6'1". The interior height of the tent is 43 inches high. The bathtub floor, it does have a bathtub floor, length is 84 inches long. Had absolutely no problems with room in this tent. Even when, and we'll talk about this, we were able to squeeze 3 of us into this tent in Utah because we couldn't find any hammock hanging spots. The bathtub floor width is stated on their website as 68 to 70 inches wide. The overall tent weight is 47 ounces. And I found that to be fairly accurate. That includes stuff sacks, stakes, the strut that's in there for the tent. Tarptent uses 30D silicone coated fabric, which has been fantastic. It is definitely a good balance between overall toughness and durability, as well as lightweight. And the only way you're gonna get a little lighter is by choosing, of course, a lighter fabric. And the most popular fabric right now, it seems that the trend is Cuban fiber. But I like the durability that this 30D silicone coated fabric gives. It's really tough. And especially when I was choosing something that I wanted my kids to be able to run in and out of, because they do a lot, and not have to worry about abrasion resistance or something that they would rip or tear, then this kind of really fit the bill. This tent amazes me with how big it is. If you purchase this for 2 people in mind, let's say 2 large size pads, then you have absolutely no problem. It's palatial. Subaru Josh and I actually shared this one of the nights in Utah, and there was more than enough room. You can spread out. We had room for all our gear, all of our stuff inside the tent. We actually didn't have to use the really large vestibules, which are fantastic. And in a pinch, because we couldn't find any camping spots, one of the other nights in Utah, that's one of the dangers in going out west, and I'm really glad that I sleep with a pad in my hammock. It was able to barely squeeze 3 large pads in there. Now, it's actually not recommended that you do that. Tarptent wisely says you can fit 2 large pads and a regular size pad. We were able to get 3 large pads in there. Was it really tight? Yes, it was. It was almost like the entire floor of the tarp tent was just all pads, and we all had to kind of get it in one at a time. But there was some room to maneuver. It wasn't terrible because I was in the middle. The guys in the outer ends may have had some issue, but we'll get to that in the cons section when we talk about the tarp tent. Ventilation and views is something that Tarptent mentions on their website, and it's absolutely true. This tent does a remarkable job of making sure that you can open up, access, get a lot of airflow both at the head end and the foot end, and you can control exactly how much airflow and venting you want. That really helps with condensation and making sure you don't get a lot of that. Remember, this is a single wall tent, and so that's something you have to be aware of. Single wall tents tend to have a greater chance or likelihood of having condensation issues. On really nice days, it was fantastic to open this tent up and just feel like you're outside. There's sometimes, and one of the reasons I like porch mode in a hammock is because you can see it's really open. And so for a tent, I never felt like it was super closed off or claustrophobic. I felt like it did a really nice job of making sure that we were out there. But the flip side of that is, how does it perform in really wet weather? And we had a couple of big rains, big storms come down, and the tarp tent did a great job. It shedded all that water. It becomes almost like, if you wanted to, and I know they probably wouldn't like me saying this, almost like a sealed cocoon if you really had to. So you can close up the foot end pretty well and be pretty much waterproof down there. The head end has a really nice vestibule. All we had to do is zip that vestibule closed. We actually kept the mesh part open, and it was still kind of airy. It never felt like it was super closed off or stuffy, and it performed fantastic. Subaru Josh has a great story because I actually lent him this tent, and he had a major storm that they went through, him and his wife, and what they were able to do is they were really proud of how the tent performed in that weather. And it just did a nice job of shedding water and no issues with water coming in at all. I seam sealed it myself. Tarp Tent offers it as a service, and so fantastic. Another great thing about this tent is it's very adjustable. A lot of the areas you can tighten line locks, make sure you take up any sag, anything that happens over the tent, and make sure you get a nice taut pitch. And it was really easy to adjust. It has become really fast over time. The more I do it, just with anything, the more practice you have, the faster you get at it. And Tarp Tent does a great job of making their tent design so, let's say if even it was pouring in the rain, I feel confident that this tent wouldn't have any water issues on the inside while I'm getting it set up, because it's designed to set up technically in the pouring rain, and you likely shouldn't have any issues with the inside of the tarp tent getting wet. The last major pro I want to talk about specifically is the ability for this to be a great camping tent for a family. And so my kids are all fairly young, so we're talking ranging in ages from 5 years old, I have 3 of them, up to 9 years old. And so this is a 3-person tent, and when I talk about fitting 3 grown guys in there, I had no issues with myself in there and my 3 kids in there, and we had room to spare. At this age, I know they'll grow pretty fast and there'll come a point where we can't do that anymore, but right now we can do that really, really easily. And it was great to know that because of the construction of the tent, the materials that they chose, is that I really wasn't super concerned of the kids knocking the tent over. I didn't ever feel like it was something where they would, trip at the doorway, because kids sometimes, let's be honest, are a little clumsy. At least some of mine are. And they run around, they kind of get into things. The guy lines around the tent was never an issue where I felt like, oh my gosh, they popped this guy line out, so now the tent's going to absolutely fall over. A couple of times, of course, they tripped over a guy line and it popped out some, but it was just as simple as going outside, kind of readjusting the tent pitch. No issues at all. But you didn't come to this review just to hear about the positive things about the tarp tent. You want to also hear about the cons. The major con is that it's a single wall tent, so you do have to battle a little bit with condensation. That happens with all single wall shelters. It just means that you have to do a really nice job of choosing your campsites carefully. Think about ventilation and airflow where you're camping down towards water and in a hollow area where you're definitely going to build up a lot of condensation. Is potentially not a great spot, especially in humid or wet weather. That being said, we talked about the ventilation already, and this tent does a great job in not getting a whole lot of condensation as long as you stay away from the sides of the tent. So going back to that night in Utah where we had 3 guys crammed into that tent, I was in the middle, so I was fine. Subaru Josh was also okay, but Karate Josh, he had his quilt up against the wall of the tent. Those of you guys who are tent campers know right away what happened is his quilt was soaked, and I remember him having to dry out his quilt. Now that wouldn't have been an issue if we were using the tarp tent like it was supposed to, 2 wide pads and a regular size pad in there. Instead we had 3 large size pads. So consider, just like with all tents, don't be up against the tent wall, or like with hammock camping, if you're foot box or something is up against the tarp, it will have condensation, and I don't blame the tarp tent for that. It's just something to keep in mind. Secondly, you have to worry about sil nylon sag. So I talked about that wet weather and tent pitch, and of course the material does, it's not sil poly, and it's not something where you have Cuban fiber that's just gonna absolutely shed water and not absorb much of anything at all and stay taut without having to be retensioned. The tarp tent does need to be retensioned in wet weather. It's simple though. Let me think about a tarp tent. You have maybe 5 or 6 points where you can just tighten everything up. It was as simple for me as if I had to go to the bathroom or something, going around, cinching things down, tightening things up, and it was done. But something to consider is that you do have to do that because it is not one of those fabrics that sheds water without sagging. Sil nylon in general, and this fabric does sag a little bit. The final con is that they did a nice job with the Rainshadow 3 of making the entryway really wide, and whereas the foot end was a little bit narrower. Like I said, I never had any issues with headspace or room in the tarp tent, but being a single entry slash exit sometimes got a little annoying, especially with kids. It's nice that they made it nice and wide, but if you were looking for a dual entry exit tent, this may not be the tent for you because single entry, and so anytime someone wants to leave the tent, and especially with 3 kids, they want to leave the tent a lot. Dad, I have to go potty. Dad, I need this. Dad, I need that. And so it was zip, unzip, in and out, in and out. Where I especially noticed it is not necessarily with the kids because they're smaller, but with the 3 guys, it became like a, let's kind of figure out who maneuvers where first. I remember at some points I was more towards the foot end to allow the 2 Joshes to get in and out when we were kind of getting ready for bed. Just keep in mind, single entry, single exit. So it's just going to be a choke point for people in and out of the tent. I absolutely love the Tarptent Rainshadow 3. And just a note, like I mentioned before, this purchase was supported by saving up Patreon money over a couple months. So thank you to this Patreon supporters for doing that. It allows me to bring gear to you guys that I may not have been able to purchase just on my own. But Tarptent didn't provide this tent for me for a review. This is all, I guess you consider Patreon support and my additional monies as well. So what do you guys think? Is this a tent that you would potentially buy? I encourage you to go ahead and give Tarptent a look if you haven't as yet. If you're a ground dweller looking for a cottage made tent, something that's made here in the United States, look no further, I think, than Tarptent. They have lots of great options, and I'm actually thinking of picking up a 1-person tent in the future, and I will look at Tarptent again. Thanks as always for watching, guys. Peace.